It started with a headline that spread faster than wildfire. A billionaire's home, a caretaker with a shadowed past, and 2 children caught in the storm. By the time the cameras swarmed the gates of the Al-Rashid estate, the whispers had already turned into accusations. But in a town built on appearances, the truth was never simple, and neither was loyalty. Behind closed doors, choices would be made that could bind hearts together or tear them apart forever. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The first thing Samira noticed was the quiet. Not the friendly kind, but the careful hush you hear in a church after the last hymn. Ravenswood Hill sat just outside Boston, all trimmed hedges and old money, where folks waved without moving their wrists and watched the newcomers from behind ironwork gates. A guard walked her along a slate path at the side of the house, not the front. The big entry, all glass and stone, stayed shut like a mouth that did not care to speak. "Ms. Holt," the guard said, polite practiced. "This way." She nodded and kept her bag close. The agency had said 7 housekeepers had come and gone in 6 months. Twins. 8 years old. Bright. Undisciplined. Grieving. The words clattered in her head like loose silver. She had told the recruiter she could handle it, and she believed that mostly. What she hadn't said out loud was the part about the hospital bill she'd finished paying, the aftertaste of worry that still lived in her chest. Her foster mother was stable now. Samira needed steady work, not a revolving door. They passed a long window. Inside, white walls, high ceilings, a piano tucked into a corner like someone had meant to play and then thought better of it. The guard talked about schedules and access badges. She heard him, but not all the way. In her mind, she set up small rules to protect herself. Keep a little distance. Don't get attached. Do the job, do it well, then go home in one piece. Karim Al-Rashid's name had a way of filling a room. Papers called him a biotech visionary. People called him other things, depending on the party they were standing in. Widower. Billionaire. Private. She had no interest in any of that. She was here for 2 boys who had lost their mother and decided to kick the world until it noticed. The guard opened a side door and stepped back. "You'll want the great room first." Samira walked into cool air and lemon polish, a space so wide her footsteps felt small. Sun pooled across the floor in long, quiet stripes. Then she saw them. 2 boys, same height, same dark hair, same set to the jaw, stood at a white wall with uncapped markers in their fists. Blue, green, blazing red. A forest of lines climbed from baseboard to crown molding. One boy glanced over his shoulder, cheek smudged, eyes steady. The other kept drawing, slow on purpose. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Samira set her bag down, folded her hands, and met their gaze. Her heartbeat calmed, one breath, then another. The wall could be cleaned. The boys were the work. Samira stood rooted in place, eyes tracing the mess of color spread across the once pristine wall. The boys worked in silence, small hands moving with the easy confidence of artists who knew their canvas could not stop them. Red bled into green in jagged angles. Blue streaks cut diagonally across the space like lightning. Neither Amir nor Zayd seemed to acknowledge her presence. It was as though she had stepped into a scene they'd been rehearsing long before she arrived. The quiet broke with the faint creak of a door somewhere deeper in the house. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, and then a man appeared in the wide doorway. Tall and lean, dressed in a slate-gray suit without a wrinkle, he smiled as though he was about to compliment someone, though his eyes held something cooler. "Well, Karim," he said, his voice pitched to carry. "Another new face already?" His gaze slid toward Samira, moving slowly, appraising. "You might want someone who fits this environment a little better." The pause was intentional. He let the words hang, enough for their weight to settle into the room. His meaning was plain, the kind of insinuation that didn't need to be spelled out, about her skin, her clothes, the way she'd come in through the side entrance. Karim appeared behind him, stepping in from the hall with the casual grace of someone accustomed to holding all the cards. "Preston," he said lightly, "we can talk about the zoning plans in my study." Preston offered a smile that looked practiced, a shape he'd worn many times in the presence of people he didn't quite respect. "Of course. I'll let you get acquainted." The slight tilt of his head towards Samira added a sharp edge to the parting words. She didn't answer him. Instead, she shifted her attention back to the wall, to the boys who still had their markers poised like weapons. Her voice was calm, her tone even. "You made it. You'll clean it. I'll help." It wasn't loud, but both boys looked up. Amir's mouth curled into a quick smirk, and Zayd huffed a short laugh. Whatever they'd been expecting from her, it wasn't that. Still, when she crossed to a small cart tucked near the corner and pulled out 2 soft cloths, they took them without protest. "Start from the bottom," she told them, crouching to their level. "Small circles. Gentle, so you don't hurt the wall." They followed her example, their movements clumsy at first, smearing colors into softer blurs. Now and then they traded quiet remarks about the shapes they'd drawn, about how long it would take to clean it all. Zayd decided the blue marker had been worth it no matter what. Preston's footsteps retreated down the hall, his voice low as he spoke to Karim. Before leaving, he glanced over his shoulder, the same sharp, calculating look as before, like he was memorizing her for later use. The cleaning went on until their wrists tired. Samira stood and stretched her knees, brushing dust from her palms. "We'll finish tomorrow," she said simply. No scolding, no sugarcoating, just the sense that this was a task to be completed together, not a punishment. That evening, Karim sat in his study with a cup of black coffee cooling on the desk. His laptop was open to a thick stack of digital reports, yet his eyes drifted to a corner of the screen where the feed from the hall camera played in muted colors. There they were, 2 small figures and a woman kneeling between them, their hands working in slow circles on the wall. The twins weren't arguing, weren't tossing cloths across the room. They were helping. He leaned back in his chair. This was new. Since Layla's passing, the boys had met every adult with defiance, driving them away in days. He had grown used to that resistance, even expected it. But this was different. Setting the cup aside, he left the study and followed the hall until he reached the threshold of the great room. They hadn't noticed him yet. The lamplight caught in Samira's hair as she leaned over to inspect a stubborn red streak, murmuring something that made Amir laugh under his breath. Zayd was rinsing his cloth in a small bucket, water sloshing softly. Karim stayed where he was, letting the moment be theirs. For just an instant, a warmth touched his face, a feeling he didn't try to name. Then, with the same quiet steps he'd arrived on, he turned back toward his desk, closing the door gently behind him. The kitchen smelled of warm bread and melted butter, the kind of scent that usually meant comfort. Samira stood at the counter, moving slowly, almost methodically, as she spread a thin layer of butter over 2 slices of toast. The butter disappeared into the bread in small golden swirls. She poured milk into 2 glasses, set them beside the plates, and then placed a folded napkin next to each. In her neat handwriting, she wrote, "You don't have to like it, but you'll never eat alone in this kitchen." She stared at the words longer than necessary. It was a simple kindness, something she'd done for children before, but here it felt riskier. The kitchen was starting to feel like hers, too much like hers. She'd begun to notice the way the morning sun fell across the counter, the faint hum of the fridge, the gentle echo in the high-ceilinged room. They were little things, but they could turn into attachments, and attachments had always been dangerous for her. Her mind wandered back to Maya, a girl she'd cared for not long ago. For 5 months they'd shared routines, pancakes on Saturdays, a silly bedtime song, quiet talks in the dark. Then a phone call came from the agency. And just like that, Maya was gone, placed with another family. Samira had packed the girls' things in silence, knowing it was out of her hands. After that, she promised herself she wouldn't let anything get that close again. But now here she was, buttering toast for 2 boys who didn't belong to her, feeling a familiar pull she couldn't quite stop. The sound of the front door opening cut into her thoughts. Backpacks hit the floor in the hallway, sneakers squeaked across wood. The boys entered the kitchen without their usual energy. Amir slid into his chair, eyes fixed on the plate. Zayd hesitated, staring at the napkin before taking a slow sip of milk. "You two okay?" she asked, keeping her voice light. Amir shrugged, picking at the toast. Zayd glanced at her, then back down. It wasn't just a bad mood, something had happened. She didn't push. She'd learned that with children, sometimes the truth needed time to make itself visible. At the drop-off gate that morning, she got her answer. One of the parents, chatty, eager to share, mentioned that some kids had been teasing the twins again. This time it was about their father, how he bought everything, how they could never earn anything on their own. The comments carried a sharper sting, wrapped in the unspoken prejudice about where their father came from. Samira kept her face neutral, but the words lodged in her chest. As she turned to leave, she noticed a woman a few yards away, phone in hand. The device was angled just enough to catch Samira and the boys as they walked. The woman pretended to check her screen, then lowered it quickly, avoiding eye contact. By the time Samira thought to approach her, she had blended into the flow of parents heading toward their cars. The day passed quietly. Samira kept to her usual tasks, but the image of that phone lingered in the back of her mind. She didn't mention it to the boys. They spent the afternoon working on homework at the kitchen table, occasionally bickering over pencils. It almost felt normal. That evening, after the boys had gone upstairs, Karim sat in his study reviewing documents. His phone buzzed on the desk. The message was from Preston Vale. There was no greeting, just an image and a short line of text. The picture showed Samira in the school parking lot, one hand resting lightly on Zayd's shoulder, the other holding his backpack strap. Beneath it, Preston had written, "Thought you might want to know who's spending time with your boys." Karim looked at the image for a long time. On its own, it meant nothing. But with Preston, nothing was ever casual. The man didn't waste his efforts on small nuisances. If he was taking the time to send this, it meant he'd already decided Samira was worth targeting. Leaning back in his chair, Karim felt the familiar tension in his jaw. He didn't doubt her intentions, not yet. But he also knew that in a place like Ravenswood Hill, once a story started, true or not, it had a way of spreading fast and cutting deep. Preston was good at planting those stories, and Karim had seen firsthand how quickly they could grow into something impossible to control. Karim had been home more often lately, though not in the way most fathers were. He was there without being there, hovering in doorways, lingering on the landing of the grand staircase, or standing just far enough down the hall to stay unnoticed. From those quiet perches, he watched Samira sitting cross-legged on the floor with the boys, fitting puzzle pieces together in slow, deliberate movements. He studied them in silence. Amir would hand her a piece. Zayd would try to place one in the wrong spot just to make her laugh, and Samira's patience never wavered. She didn't fawn, she didn't scold. She simply guided them toward the right fit. Something in that rhythm pulled at him, though he wasn't ready to step into it. Karim Al-Rashid's name still carried weight outside these walls. Founder of Al-Rashid Biotech, he had once stood in the bright, merciless glare of the press, smiling through interviews and investor summits. Since Layla's death, the spotlight had dimmed by his choice. Now his public appearances were calculated, rare enough to seem tasteful, frequent enough to keep the company's image polished. His goal was simple: maintain the picture of a model family, to steady the stock price, and keep major projects moving forward. Everything was strategy. But life at home was a different calculation. One morning, an invitation arrived from the Boston Grand Hall for him to speak at a high-profile charity gala. It would have been good press, the kind that reassured donors and business partners alike. Karim declined. Leaving the twins for a night meant putting them in someone else's care, and despite Samira's progress, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He told himself it was about the boys. But there was also a part of him that wasn't ready to see this house without his presence, even for a few hours. When Preston Vale heard about his refusal, he made sure to twist the knife. Karim was on his way to the car when Preston called out from across the drive, voice dripping with casual mockery. "I hear you're letting the hired help run the household now. Careful, Karim. Next thing you know, she'll be telling you where to invest." Karim didn't answer, but the words stayed with him. Preston's disdain was nothing new, but lately, the man seemed intent on testing every seam in the walls Karim had built. Late one afternoon, Samira went upstairs to tend to the music room, a space she hadn't set foot in until then. Dust lay thick across the piano's lid, the faint scent of cedar still clinging to the air. She opened the tall cabinet against the far wall, straightening stacks of sheet music. Near the back, she found a slim leather-bound folder, its edges worn from use. Inside, the pages were filled with a single piece, written in careful, looping handwriting. The title read Layla's Lullaby. Her fingers brushed the notes almost without thinking, and before she realized it, she was humming the melody. The sound was soft, a low thread of music winding through the stillness. She'd never heard the song before, but it felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. Amir and Zayd wandered in, drawn by the sound. They stopped just inside the doorway, eyes wide. "You know that song?" Amir asked quietly. Samira glanced up, caught between surprise and a sudden ache in her chest. "I found it here," she said. "It's beautiful." Neither boy moved, as if the room itself had gone still. They stepped closer, listening as she let the melody spill from her voice again, tentative but steady. The notes hung in the air, warm and aching all at once. At the doorway, Karim appeared. He didn't announce himself, just stood there, caught by the sound. His gaze fixed on Samira's, hands holding the worn sheet, then on his son's, rapt, unmoving. For a brief moment, something raw flickered across his face. Grief sharp enough to sting, wonder deep enough to hold him there. Saturday morning came dressed in the kind of light that makes everything look softer than it really is. The sky stretched clear and pale, the trees along the walk to the park turning shades of copper and gold. Samira kept her pace even, one hand on Amir's shoulder, the other on Zayd's. The boys were subdued, trading a few private jokes now and then, their voices low enough to be lost in the rustle of leaves overhead. Ravenswood Hill had a way of pretending it was friendly. Benches dotted the pathways, hedges were clipped to perfection, and people nodded politely as you passed. But behind those nods, Samira could feel the quiet calculation, the kind where eyes lingered just a second too long, as if measuring you against an invisible standard. She caught the quick glance of a woman in a camel coat who leaned toward her companion, lips moving in a private comment. A man with a Labrador gave a curt smile, but kept watching as they walked by. They reached the park's edge, where the swing set stood in a neat rectangle of mulch. The boys moved ahead, their steps quickening at the sight. Samira was about to follow when a voice, warm on the surface, but sharpened underneath, floated across the path. "Well, good morning." Preston Vale was dressed as if he were headed to a board meeting rather than a stroll. Pressed slacks, navy sweater over a crisp shirt, loafers that had never seen rain. His smile was polite in shape, but cold in temperature. "Out enjoying the neighborhood, I see." "It's a nice day for the park," Samira replied, her tone light, offering nothing more. He took a few steps closer, hands resting in his pockets. His gaze moved over the twins before returning to her face. "Careful, he said, almost conversationally. "Children in this neighborhood learn how to behave from the company they keep." The words landed without raising his voice, but they didn't need volume to make their point. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. Samira didn't stop to trade looks or barbs. She simply reached out, taking Amir's hand in one of hers, Zayd's in the other. "Come on," she told them, her voice pitched for them alone. "The swings aren't going to race themselves." As they walked past him, she caught a flash of confusion in Preston's eyes, as though he'd expected her to bristle or argue. But it wasn't his opinion that stung. It was the way the boys' postures shifted, shoulders tightening, heads lowering, as if they'd learned long ago what that sort of comment meant. That small, silent retreat in them was the thing that hurt most. By late afternoon, Preston's morning smile had already turned into something more deliberate. He phoned the administration at Ravenswood Elementary, weaving his concern into a story that sounded almost helpful. He suggested, without accusing, that the household help might be making certain choices about the boys' school life in place of their father. His tone, she knew, would have been smooth enough to sound sincere and vague enough to leave a stain without offering proof. The first Samira knew of it was when Karim appeared in the kitchen doorway. The light from the hall framed him, his expression unreadable except for the slight narrowing of his eyes. "I got a call from the school today," he said, voice steady but edged. "The principal seemed to think you've been making decisions on my behalf." She turned from the sink, drying her hands on a towel, and faced him directly. "I don't make decisions for you, Karim. I'm just there when you can't be." It wasn't defiance in her voice. It was truth, delivered plainly. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them thick with things neither was saying. Karim held her gaze, his own carrying something layered, a flicker of gratitude, a trace of suspicion, not in her, but in the situation, and the quiet instinct of a man used to guarding his family. After a long beat, he gave a small nod that didn't resolve anything and stepped back into the hallway. Samira watched him go, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading. The boys were upstairs, laughing over some shared joke, their voices light and untroubled. She leaned against the counter, letting the weight of the exchange settle. She knew this wouldn't be the last time Preston tried to wedge doubt between them. And she knew she couldn't let him succeed, not for her sake, but for theirs. The morning began like any other Monday, but it didn't stay that way for long. Samira had just pulled the last slice of toast from the toaster when her phone started buzzing. One ping, then another, then a flood. The screen lit up with names she hadn't heard from in years, each message carrying the same unspoken urgency. When she finally opened one, her chest tightened. The link led to the Ravenswood Chronicle, the neighborhood's modest paper that rarely made it past the county line. Yet today, it had clawed its way into every social media feed she scrolled through. The headline seemed to scream off the screen. Billionaire Al-Rashid hires caregiver with criminal past? Beneath it was a grainy, unflattering photo of her, one she didn't even remember being taken. The article was a masterclass in implication, not truth. It dug up an old foster care case from years ago, when a little girl she had housed for 5 months was sent back into the state system after a custody dispute. The case had left scars, but no charges, no proof of wrongdoing. That didn't stop the Chronicle from painting it in the darkest tones possible. By mid-morning, whispers had morphed into open chatter. At Ravenswood Elementary, parents formed tight circles in the parking lot. When Samira walked past, voices dropped just enough to let her know she was the topic. A few parents gave curt nods, others avoided her entirely. She overheard words that stuck like splinters: reckless, not safe, can't be too careful. And then came the media trucks. 2 of them, heavy with satellite dishes and bold station logos, rolled up to the iron gates of Al-Rashid estate. The engines barely cooled before cameras swung into place. From inside the foyer, Samira could see them through the tall glass panels. Reporters in long coats holding microphones, scanning for any sign of movement. The security intercom buzzed. "We've got press out here asking about the kids," the guard's voice crackled. Karim was upstairs, buried in work. She could have left it to him. She could have stayed hidden. But then one question rose above the hum of the crowd, sharp and taunting. "Ms. Holt, do you think someone with your record should be a role model for these boys?" Samira froze for half a second. She wasn't surprised they'd framed it that way, turning an old wound into a public spectacle. She stepped forward until she was close enough for the gate to cast long shadows across her face. "I'm not here to be a role model," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "I'm here to be present. When they need someone, when they're scared or sick or hurt, I'll be the one who shows up. That's what matters." A few camera shutters clicked in quick bursts. Someone in the back murmured, perhaps disappointed she hadn't snapped back with something more sensational. Then came the sound of a car door shutting, heavy and deliberate. The reporters shifted, lenses swiveling toward the man approaching from the driveway. Karim walked with a measured pace, his coat moving slightly in the early fall breeze. He didn't look at the cameras right away. Instead, he positioned himself beside her, his presence alone altering the energy. Without saying a word to the press, he placed his hand lightly on her shoulder. It wasn't a casual touch, it was deliberate, a public signal that he was standing with her. Not behind her, not in front of her, with her. The flashes intensified, a staccato of light and sound. A reporter tried again, calling Karim's name, but he didn't take the bait. His gaze swept the crowd, cool and steady, before he gave a small nod toward the gatehouse. The guard understood, and the heavy gates began to swing shut. They walked back up the long drive together in silence. Samira's pulse was still quick, but her steps felt steadier than when she'd walked out. She didn't need to look at him to know that something had shifted. This job had started as a lifeline, a way to cover bills, to keep moving forward. But now the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about her paycheck or her reputation. It was about holding onto the fragile connection she had with Amir and Zayd, a bond that had only just begun to take root. The day began like it always did, quiet, predictable, until Samira's phone lit up with a dozen notifications in under a minute. She was rinsing out the coffee pot when the first one buzzed across the counter, then another and another, until the small kitchen felt like it was vibrating. Curiosity turned to dread as she tapped the screen. The Ravenswood Chronicle had never been more than a local gossip rag, but today its headline was everywhere. Facebook posts, neighborhood forums, even in the parents' group text she usually ignored. Billionaire Al-Rashid hires caregiver with criminal past? The photo beneath the headline was grainy, clearly taken without her knowledge, maybe outside the school. The article didn't outright lie, but it twisted every fact it could reach. It dredged up an old foster care case from her past, a bitter chapter when a 5-year-old girl she'd loved and cared for had been pulled from her home and returned to the system. The courts had never found her at fault, but the Chronicle made sure no reader would miss the question mark hanging over her name. By the time she arrived at Ravenswood Elementary to drop off Amir and Zayd, the whispers were no longer whispers. Parents clustered in small groups by the parking lot, their eyes sliding toward her before darting away. She heard fragments of conversation as she passed, phrases that landed like small stones against her back. Background check, safety, can't be too careful. And then, before lunch was over, the cameras came. 2 vans with station logos parked just outside the wrought iron gates of the Al-Rashid estate. Tripods unfolded, microphones were fitted with foam windshields, and lenses were trained on the house like rifles. From the upstairs hallway, Samira could see them milling around the gate, calling out to anyone who passed. "Ms. Holt," one voice shouted the moment she stepped into view. "Do you think someone with your history should be around children at all?" Her first instinct was to keep walking, to vanish into the house and let the noise pass. But then another voice cut through. "Do you believe you're a good role model for these boys?" That one made her stop. She stepped closer, far enough that the lines of the black gate split her face into narrow segments for the cameras. Her voice was steady when she answered. "I'm not here to be a role model," she said. "I'm here to be present. When they're scared or sick or hurt, I'll be the one who shows up. That's the job. That's what matters." For a moment, all that moved was the flickering red light of the camera. Then a staccato burst of shutters filled the air. A low thump came from behind her, car door closing. The press shifted, a ripple of murmurs passing through them as Karim emerged from the long drive. He walked without hurry, coat buttoned against the early fall chill, his expression unreadable. When he reached her side, he didn't speak to the reporters. He didn't explain or defend. He simply laid a hand on her shoulder, firm enough to feel, light enough not to hold her in place. It was an unspoken statement, a shield and a claim all at once. The photographers surged forward, flashes popping against the pale morning light. Karim's gaze swept over them, calm and cool, before he gave a brief nod toward the gatehouse. The security guard understood and began to swing the heavy gates shut, the metal groaning as it closed the reporters out. They turned together toward the house. The walk back up the drive was silent, but it wasn't the same silence they'd had in the past. This one carried weight, something settled but unfinished. Inside, Samira's pulse was still high, but her hands no longer shook. This job had begun as a way to pay bills, a bridge until she figured out her next step. But standing in front of those cameras, she realized it was more than that now. She wasn't just earning a paycheck. She was protecting the fragile trust she'd built with Amir and Zayd. The house was quiet in that particular way. It only got after Amir and Zayd were finally asleep, television off, dishwasher humming softly, the occasional creak from the old staircase. Samira was folding the last of the laundry when her phone buzzed on the counter, screen lighting up with a name she hadn't seen in years. Linda Cooper. She hesitated for just a second before swiping to answer. Linda? It's been a long time. I know, Linda said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. And I wouldn't call this late unless it was important. Samira straightened, pressing the phone to her ear. What's happened? It's Maya. The name landed like a stone in her chest. She's in a bad spot. Her adoptive family's going through. Well, let's just say they can't take care of her right now. She needs somewhere safe. Temporary, but soon. Tonight, if possible. Samira leaned back against the counter, the folded towel slipping from her hand. She could see Maya as clearly as if the girl had just been there that morning. Her shy smile, the way she used to braid scraps of yarn into her doll's hair, the fierce hug she gave the day the social worker came to take her away. I wouldn't be calling if there were other options, Linda added quietly. If I can get her to you, would you take her back? It should have been a yes, without question. But the truth was more tangled. A child in the Al-Rashid estate who wasn't family? In Ravenswood Hill, that would stir more gossip than a fire alarm. Preston Vale would pounce on it like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. And Karim, he might see it as Samira stretching herself too thin, not fully devoted to Amir and Zayd. Samira swallowed hard. I'll think about it, she said, though the part of her that still kept Maya's old crayon drawings in a shoebox already knew the answer. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heating system, her mind replaying the last time she'd seen Maya. The girl's eyes had been bright with unshed tears, her hands clutching the straps of her backpack, as if holding on to something solid. Samira had promised herself she wouldn't let it hurt that way again. By morning, her decision wasn't any clearer. She moved through breakfast on autopilot, toast, eggs, 2 glasses of milk, while answering the boys' questions without really hearing them. They darted upstairs for their backpacks, leaving her in the kitchen staring at the grain of the wooden table, wishing it could give her answers. She didn't notice Preston in the doorway until he spoke. Morning, he said, wearing that neighborly smile that never reached his eyes. I hear you might be expanding your little household. Her pulse quickened. Where did you hear that? Oh, I have friends in all sorts of places, Preston said lightly, brushing an imaginary speck from his cuff. It's just people here like to feel reassured. 2 boys to look after is already a handful. Add a foster kid, and they might start questioning if this arrangement is really in the best interest of the family. Samira kept her tone even. Thanks for the concern, Preston. I'll keep that in mind. He smiled sharper at that, the kind of expression that told her he thought he'd planted a seed of doubt. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. She checked her phone for a message from Linda more often than she wanted to admit. She found herself lingering by the window when the school bus dropped the boys off, thinking how Maya might fit into this picture, or how quickly the balance could collapse. That evening, Amir and Zayd curled up on the sofa under a shared blanket, half asleep before the movie even reached the halfway mark. Samira stood at the living room window, looking out at the dim glow of the street lamps, the quiet, perfect order of Ravenswood Hill. Behind her, the boys breathed in sync, their small bodies relaxed in the safety of routine. She wanted to protect that, shield it from the stares, the whispers, the headlines. But she could hear Maya's voice in her mind, uncertain and small, asking if she could come home. The sun had barely burned through the soft morning haze when Karim locked his car in the Ravenswood Hill parking lot. The quiet was broken by a voice that never failed to tighten his jaw. Morning, Karim. I hear your house is about to turn into an orphanage. Preston Vale stood a few feet away, one hand in his pocket, a smirk curling his lips. Karim didn't bother to ask how Preston knew anything. He always knew something. Good morning, Preston, Karim replied, his tone calm but clipped. Enjoy your day. He walked away before Preston could tack on anything else. But the words followed him home, sticking like burrs. When Karim stepped inside the estate, he found Samira in the kitchen rinsing blueberries for the boys' breakfast. The smell of toasted bread lingered in the air. She looked up and smiled faintly, but his expression was unreadable. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Are you planning to stay here, completely committed to Amir and Zayd? Or do you have other obligations you haven't mentioned?" Samira set the colander down, the drip of water loud in the pause. "If you're asking whether I'd walk away without warning, no," she said carefully. "But there's someone from my past who might need me. I haven't decided what I can do yet." His gaze held hers, searching. "I'm not angry, Samira. But those boys have been through enough. I need to know your priorities." She wanted to tell him that her priority wasn't a single person. It was the principle of never letting a child feel abandoned. But she could already feel how complicated the truth might sound, so she held back. By lunchtime, the air between them hadn't shifted. The boys sat at the dining table, chattering about a science project, until Amir suddenly grew quiet. "Miss Samira?" he asked, his voice small. "Yes." She looked up, smiling without thinking. "If somebody else needed you, would you leave us?" Her fork froze. "Why would you ask me that?" He shrugged, looking at his plate. "Just wondering." There was a raw edge to the question that made her chest ache. "Amir," she said softly, "I'm here now. And when I'm here, I'm not going anywhere." The words seemed to comfort him, but she could tell he was filing them away, measuring them against whatever came next. That evening, while the boys were upstairs showering, Samira sat cross-legged on the living room floor, folding laundry. The rhythm of it calmed her: shirt, pants, socks. She didn't notice Zayd until he was standing right in front of her, something clutched behind his back. "I made you something," he said, his grin shy but proud. He held out a piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing. 3 stick figures under a slanted roof, all smiling, with the word "stay" written in wobbly, uneven letters above their heads. Her throat tightened instantly. "Zayd, this is beautiful." "That's us," he said matter-of-factly. "You, me, and Amir. Under our house." She reached out, pulling him into a hug. His hair still smelled of the citrus shampoo she'd handed him an hour earlier. "I'll keep it forever," she whispered. When he darted off to join Amir, she stayed kneeling on the floor, the paper warm from his hands still in hers. It wasn't just a drawing, it was an anchor, a claim, maybe even a plea. Later that night, the house was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Samira sat at the kitchen table, the crayoned drawing beside her phone. She replayed every moment of the day in her mind. The sting of Preston's remark, Karim's measured voice, Amir's question, Zayd's gift. She picked up the phone and dialed Linda's number. "Linda? Give me one more day," she said the moment her friend answered. "I need to figure out how to make this work for both." Her voice trembled, but something inside her had solidified. She wasn't going to choose between the people she loved if there was any way not to. For the first time since hearing about Maya, she felt like she was steering the ship instead of bracing for the next wave. Upstairs, the boys had fallen asleep on the same bed, their legs tangled like they'd been mid-whisper and drifted off. Samira stood in the doorway for a long time, the drawing folded neatly in her hand. She knew the decisions she made in the next 24 hours could redraw the shape of both their lives and hers. But right now, all she could think was that somehow she had to find a way for stay to mean the same thing to everyone under this roof. Monday morning carried a different weight than usual. Karim stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie with practiced precision. Downstairs, the hum of the espresso machine and the faint aroma of roasted beans filled the kitchen. Today wasn't just another business meeting. It was the product launch for Al-Rashid Biotech, an event broadcast live to investors, journalists, and the medical community. His phone buzzed every few seconds with updates from the PR team. Arrival of the press vans, last-minute changes to the speaker lineup, and the exact time his car would be waiting. Across town, Samira sat at the kitchen table, a mug of tea gone cold beside her. Her phone lit up with a new message from Linda. "Maya's not doing well. The family she's with can't handle her anymore. She's asking for you." Samira's stomach twisted. She had promised Linda one more day, but the clock was running out. Each text from Linda sharpened the edge of urgency, making it harder to pretend she could still take her time. Meanwhile, Preston was busy stirring a different storm. In the community hall, just beyond the park, he had gathered a handful of Ravenswood Hill parents. The coffee gurgled in the corner, but no one was here for caffeine. They were here for whispers. Whispers Preston was more than happy to feed. "I hate to say it," he began, his voice laced with mock concern, "but we have to think about the boys' well-being. This isn't gossip, it's about safety." He produced his phone, scrolling to an audio file. The muffled sound of Samira's voice filled the room, edited and spliced a sound as though she were saying, "I can't stay here much longer." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Preston pressed a point. "You all know the history, the news stories, the court documents. Do we really want our kids around someone who's already planning her exit?" By mid-morning, the spark had caught. Posts began circulating online, screenshots of the doctored audio. Old headlines dredged up from Samira's foster care days. The hashtag Protect the Twins appeared on Twitter and spread to Facebook, each share tinged with righteous outrage. Samira's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Messages pinged in from numbers she didn't recognize, some accusing, others pretending to warn her of what people were saying. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on folding the boys' laundry, but her hands shook too much to fold straight. At the launch venue, Karim's presentation was halfway through when the questions started veering off script. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts as a man in the back row raised his voice over the polite applause. "Mr. Al-Rashid," he called out, "are you aware your children's caretaker is allegedly planning to leave them? Reports suggest she's been in talks to take in another child, possibly at the expense of Amir and Zayd. Do you have a response?" The room went still. Karim, mid-step across the stage, stopped. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Confusion, then calculation, then something darker. The reporters leaned forward like spectators waiting for a verdict. Samira, watching the live stream on her tablet at home, froze when she saw the shift in his expression. Her heart pounded. She knew he had no way of knowing the truth from the mess Preston had spun, and no time to parse it with the world watching. The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker in Karim's eyes. He inhaled slowly, one hand curling around the microphone. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he said nothing. Viewers across the country would later describe that silence differently. Some as composure, some as hesitation, and others as the moment they realized the story had gotten to him. But Samira didn't see a businessman calculating his public image. She saw a father weighing the safety of his children against the loyalty of someone who had become part of their home. She also saw the same man who had stood beside her at the gates, taking the brunt of the cameras without a single word of apology for her presence there. She sat back, the tea beside her now ice cold. Whether Karim defended her or distanced himself, she knew this was the moment the ground beneath them all began to crack. And once cracks appeared, it was only a matter of time before something gave way. The live stream cut to a wide shot, showing Karim alone at the center of the stage, every eye in the room, and far beyond it, fixed on what he would do next. Karim didn't wait for the applause to fade at the end of his presentation. He handed the microphone to a stunned PR manager and stepped down from the stage, ignoring the questions hurled at his back. The ride home was silent except for the low hum of the car engine. His driver glanced at him once in the rearview mirror, but one look at Karim's face was enough to keep quiet. By the time he reached the estate, the morning sun had climbed high, casting sharp shadows along the stone walls. He walked straight through the foyer, bypassing his assistant's attempt to hand him a phone. "Later," he said, his voice clipped. He knew exactly where to find her. Samira was in the music room, the late morning light spilling across the polished piano. She sat at the bench, not playing, just folding sheet music with careful precision. He recognized the title on top, Layla's Lullaby, and noticed she was tucking it into the small wooden box she kept locked. "Is it true?" Karim's voice cut through the quiet. "Are you planning to leave this house?" Samira turned slowly. Her hands were still on the music, her fingers pressed flat as if to steady herself. "If you're asking whether I planned to walk out on Amir and Zayd, no. That's never been my intention." Her tone wavered, but there was steel beneath it. Then explain to me, he said, stepping closer, why I'm hearing about a little girl named Maya from reporters, and not from you. Samira swallowed hard. Because every time I think about Maya, I remember the day they took her from me. I was her foster mother for 14 months. And then, one morning, a social worker came and said her birth family was ready. She cried so hard her nose bled, but I had no choice. I signed the papers. Her voice dropped. She's in trouble again, Karim. Her adoptive family. Something happened. Linda called me. She needs somewhere to go now. He studied her face, searching for deception, but finding only exhaustion. You were going to take her in? Yes. But not instead of the boys. Her eyes met his, steady now. I was trying to figure out how to make it work for all three. Because I can't lose Maya again. And I can't leave Amir and Zayd. She stopped herself, as if the words were too heavy to push through. Karim exhaled slowly. I've known about Maya for weeks, he said. One of my late wife's colleagues at the welfare department mentioned her. And I also know Preston's been sitting on that information, waiting to use it against me. He's already hinted that if I don't bend on the Ravenswood Hill development deal, he'll feed this to the press in the worst possible light. Samira's head tilted slightly, surprise flickering across her features. You knew, and you didn't say anything? I was trying to see where your priorities lay, he admitted. And I didn't want to bring Preston's poison into this house unless I had to. Her lips curved, not in a smile, but something sharper. And now I know something else, Karim said, leaning against the edge of the piano. You turned down a job offer in Chicago. Executive position. High salary. You could have left quietly, taken your skills somewhere you'd never have to answer to me, or Preston, or this neighborhood. But you stayed. Samira hesitated, then gave a small nod. Because this isn't just a job anymore. It's home. And I'm not ready to walk away from it. Or from them. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was heavy, yes, but shared, two people standing at a crossroads, aware that the next step mattered more than any they'd taken before. Karim straightened, the decision settling in his posture before the words left his mouth. Then we stop letting other people write this story. I'll call a press conference. Not to deny anything, but to tell the truth. The whole truth. If someone wants to accuse you of staying with my family out of anything but choice, they'll have to do it looking me in the eye. Her brow furrowed. You take that risk? With everything you have to protect. He didn't flinch. If staying by my family's side is a crime in their eyes, then I want to commit it with you. For the first time since she'd known him, his mouth broke into a smile, not the polite, calculated one he wore for the cameras, but something unguarded. Samira felt the weight in her chest shift, just slightly, like the first crack of light through a closed door. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, drumming steadily against the tall windows of Karim's study. Outside, the grounds of the Al-Rashid estate were cloaked in darkness, the winding driveway glistening under the downpour. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with cedar from the fire burning low in the hearth. Shadows swayed across the bookshelves, and the golden desk lamp cast a halo over Karim's desk, where Samira sat with a mug of untouched tea. Karim leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, eyes fixed on her. He'd been silent for a full minute, weighing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. Tomorrow we walk into that neighborhood council meeting together. Preston will demand you be removed from this house. He'll expect me to stand aside. I won't. The words landed heavily, not as a threat, but as a vow. Samira's pulse quickened. You know, it's not just a meeting. Once you stand beside me, you're not just defending me, you're declaring a side. Karim's expression didn't waver. I already have. For a long moment, she stared at him, feeling the edges of fear and resolve pressed together in her chest. If she backed down tomorrow, she would lose her place in Amir and Zayd's lives. If she stood her ground, she'd step into a fight that could define the rest of her time here, and maybe shorten it. I'm in, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Whatever happens, I'm not leaving that room until it's over. He nodded once, decision sealed. Without hesitation, Karim reached for his phone and dialed his attorney. I want every piece of proof we have that Preston fabricated information about Samira. The altered transcripts, the doctored recordings, everything. Tomorrow, we make it clear he crossed the line." While Karim spoke into the phone, Samira's gaze drifted to the rain-streaked window. Linda's voice from earlier replayed in her mind. Maya doesn't have much time. She could almost see the little girl, dark eyes wide, clutching a small backpack as if it were armor. The image sent a deep ache through her chest. She pulled a notebook toward her and began writing a short letter to Linda. "Yes, I will take her. No matter what happens tomorrow, I will make room for her here." She signed it, her hand steady, then slid the notebook closed. When Karim ended the call, the silence that followed wasn't tense. It was the stillness before a storm. He studied her for a moment. "You're certain? Once we step into that meeting, there's no pretending none of this happened." She met his gaze and let a faint smile lift her lips. "Karim, I walked into this fight the first day I stepped through your door. Tomorrow just makes it official." His eyes softened, though his tone stayed firm. "Then we'll stand together." She rose, and he stepped aside to let her pass. But before she reached the door, movement caught her attention. There, in the hallway's dim light, stood Amir and Zayd. They were barefoot, pajama-clad, their hair mussed from sleep. Each clutched the other's hand tightly. Their eyes were wide, not frightened exactly, but watchful, the way children sense when something important is shifting in the world around them. Samira's heart clenched. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. She simply gave them a small nod, a silent promise she hoped they understood. The boys didn't reply, but they didn't let go of each other's hands as she walked past. When she reached her room, the sound of the rain was louder, almost insistent, like a ticking clock counting down the hours until morning. She lay in bed, but didn't sleep. Somewhere down the hall, she knew Karim was awake too, preparing for a fight neither of them had planned, but both were now fully committed to. The morning sky was the color of steel, heavy clouds pressing low as if the whole town was holding its breath. Ravenswood Hall loomed ahead, its stone facade weathered by decades, the arched entrance flanked by polished brass lamps that glinted against the gloom. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. Every seat in the main chamber was filled, residents in their Sunday best, murmuring quietly while a row of reporters lined the back, cameras already poised. Samira sat beside Karim in the front row. She felt the weight of the eyes on her, each glance a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something colder. Preston stood near the podium, flipping through a neat stack of papers, as if savoring the moment. When the meeting opened, he launched straight into his case. "Members of the council, neighbors, friends," he began, the word friends landing like a false note. "We are here to discuss the safety and well-being of two young boys, Amir and Zayd Al-Rashid, and whether their current caregiver is fit for such responsibility." He spoke with a calm, calculated rhythm, each sentence dripping with feigned concern. Then came the so-called evidence. Excerpts from Samira's past as a foster parent, the story of Maya retold with the edges sharpened to wound. He painted her as negligent, irresponsible, someone who abandoned a child when the going got tough. From where she sat, Samira could see the subtle nods from a few council members, the slight narrowing of eyes among the crowd. Her hands curled into fists in her lap, nails digging into her palms, but she kept her gaze steady. When Preston stepped back from the podium, the air in the room felt taut, expectant. Karim rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. His voice, when it came, was clear and unhurried. "I've listened to Mr. Preston's account," he said, "and while it was dramatic, it was also incomplete. Conveniently so." He spoke not like a man defending a stranger, but like someone defending a cornerstone of his own life. He told them about the day Samira arrived in their home, how she didn't just care for the boys, she learned them. Learned their moods, their silences, the way Amir needed space before speaking, the way Zayd's laughter could be coaxed out with the smallest kindness. Then Karim told the truth about Maya, how Samira had fought to keep her before the system forced the girl into another home, how she had stayed in touch despite the odds, how, when Maya's new placement crumbled, Samira didn't turn away. She prepared to open her door again. If that is abandonment, Karim said, letting the words hang, then perhaps we should all reconsider what love looks like. The room shifted. People were no longer leaning forward to catch Preston's next point. They were leaning toward Karim's words. Even some of the council members stopped their note-taking, pens suspended mid-air. Before anyone could speak, the sound of quick footsteps cut through the silence. From the back of the room, Amir and Zayd came running, their small shoes tapping sharply against the hardwood floor. They didn't stop until they reached Samira, throwing their arms around her waist. "She's our home." Zayd's voice rang out, high and fierce in the stillness. Amir, quieter but just as sure, added, "We don't want anyone else." Gasps rippled through the chamber, followed by an uneasy shuffle among the reporters. Someone's camera clicked, capturing the moment. Samira bent down, holding them both tightly, her eyes closing for just a second as she let the weight of their words sink in. At the front of the room, Preston's jaw tightened. He tried to mask it with a polite expression, but the faint crack in his composure was there. His hand shuffled the papers again, though there was nothing new left to say. Karim didn't gloat. He simply stood beside Samira, a silent wall of presence, while the murmur in the room grew louder. It wasn't unanimous support yet, but the tide had turned. The council chair cleared her throat, glancing between Karim and Samira with something that might have been respect. A week after the council meeting, the tension in Ravenswood Hill hadn't fully settled, but the balance had shifted. Still, Preston wasn't the kind of man to lick his wounds quietly. His charity gala invitation landed in every wealthy household in the neighborhood, an event at his grand estate that was more about influence than philanthropy. Everyone knew it. By the time Saturday night arrived, his driveway was lined with sleek European cars, and the house was glowing with warm amber light that promised luxury and exclusivity. Samira hesitated at the gates, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. "Feels like we're walking into a trap," she murmured. Karim's reply was steady. "Sometimes you have to step into the lion's den to make him choke on his own roar." Inside, the party shimmered with chandeliers, champagne flutes, and the hum of polite laughter. Preston spotted them almost instantly. His smile was the kind you give a rival in front of a crowd. Wide, insincere, a performance for the onlookers. He raised his glass as they approached. "Karim," he said, loud enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear. "And Samira, the most talked-about caretaker in Ravenswood. Truly special." A few polite chuckles turned into sharper laughs from his circle. Samira felt the heat rise to her face, but kept her expression calm, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Karim didn't flinch. "Special is one word for it," he said evenly, "but I prefer irreplaceable." The conversation shifted, people circling closer, drawn to the subtle tension. Preston launched into a story about his recent business successes, slipping in not-so-subtle jabs about how image is everything, and how some reputations can't survive certain stains. Karim let him talk. Then, when the timing was perfect, just as the laughter reached its peak, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp envelope. "Speaking of image," he said, his voice carrying, "it's funny how some people work so hard to ruin others while hiding their own behavior." Preston's smile faltered as Karim unfolded the papers. "This," Karim continued, "is a printed record of an internal email chain from your office. It shows you instructed your staff to fabricate and leak damaging information about Samira, not for the safety of children, but to pressure me into giving you the Ravenswood land parcel you've been after for years." The crowd's hum dropped into a sharp silence. Preston's face tightened. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "Anyone can fake." "I had it verified by a third-party legal team," Karim interrupted. "Twice." A few guests exchanged glances. Someone near the bar muttered, "Damn." Preston's jaw worked, but before he could form his next defense, Samira stepped forward. She hadn't planned to speak, but her voice came out clear, ringing in the high-ceilinged room. "You think I'll fold like the others. You think I'll walk away, because it's easier. But I don't walk away from children who need me. And I sure as hell don't run from men who think intimidation is a game." Her words landed heavy in the stillness. No one laughed this time. Even the clink of glasses had stopped. She held Preston's gaze for a long beat before turning slightly toward Karim, as if to show she wasn't standing there alone. The air in the room shifted. People who'd been on the fence, who'd been content to let gossip decide their opinions, now looked at Preston with a new calculation. No one moved to back him up. Preston straightened his jacket, trying to recover. "Well," he said lightly, "I suppose every story has two sides." But his voice lacked its usual confidence. Karim didn't press further. He didn't need to. The silence around Preston was louder than any argument. Samira could feel the stares now, but they were different. Not the cutting, appraising glances from before, but something closer to acknowledgement. The evening continued, but the mood had shifted entirely. And Preston, for all his posturing, had just learned what it felt like to be the one on the defensive. The call came just as the morning light was starting to creep in through the kitchen window. Samira had barely finished her first sip of coffee when Linda's voice, steady but urgent, came through the line. "Maya's been moved," Linda said. "She's in a temporary foster facility now. But if you want her with you, Samira, we have to start the process immediately. It's going to be complicated, more complicated than before, but it's still possible." Samira's hand tightened around the mug. She could picture Maya's small face, the guarded eyes that had learned too soon not to expect permanence. The thought of her staying in another unfamiliar home made Samira's chest ache. But she also thought of Amir and Zayd, the fragile trust they'd built over the past few months. They were just beginning to believe she wouldn't leave. "I need a minute," she told Linda softly, promising to call back. She hung up and sat there, staring at the table. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. It was the kind of decision that made your stomach twist, choose one child and risk hurting the others. If she brought Maya here, the dynamics would change. There'd be new routines, new demands, and plenty of opportunities for things to go wrong. But if she didn't, she might never see Maya again. While she was still lost in thought, little footsteps padded into the kitchen. Amir was rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in soft spikes. Zayd followed close behind, clutching a blanket. They slid into their chairs without a word, the quiet rhythm of morning settling over them. Samira moved to pour juice into their glasses, trying to mask the heaviness in her expression. Her phone buzzed again on the table, Linda's name lighting up the screen. She silenced it, but the boys had already noticed. Amir's voice broke the silence. "Is that about Maya?" Samira froze, pitcher in hand. "You heard?" Zayd nodded. "We were in the hall when you talked to Miss Linda." She felt the familiar urge to protect them from things they weren't ready for, but these boys had been through enough to understand more than people gave them credit for. "It's complicated," she said carefully. "If Maya comes here, I'll have to spend a lot of time helping her adjust. And I don't want you two to feel like—" "If she's your family," Amir interrupted, his voice quiet but steady, "then she's our family too." Zayd looked at his brother and then back at her. "Yeah, if you're her home, you're still ours." The words landed like a weight and a gift all at once. She felt the sting of tears but didn't let them fall. There it was, their answer. They weren't afraid of losing her to Maya. They were offering to share her. Samira took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You two don't know how much that means to me," she said, leaning down to brush her hands over their hair. "But it's not just about me. It's going to change things. It won't always be easy." Amir shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "Nothing's been easy, but we're still here." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're wiser than half the adults I know." Without waiting another moment, she picked up her phone and dialed Linda. The boys watched her closely, their orange juice untouched. When Linda answered, Samira didn't hesitate. "Bring her here," she said. "I don't care how complicated it gets. We'll make it work. All 3 kids deserve a home, and this is it." On the other end, Linda's relief was obvious. "I'll start the arrangements today. She could be with you within the week." When Samira hung up, she felt a strange mix of nerves and certainty. The road ahead would be messy, but the choice didn't feel like a gamble. It felt right. She turned to see Karim standing in the doorway, still in his dress shirt from an early meeting. He must have been listening for a while. His expression wasn't one of surprise, but of quiet pride. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Samira nodded. "Completely." A slow smile crossed his face, the kind that softened the sharp lines of his features. "Then we'll make it work," he said simply. She smiled back, feeling the ground beneath her feet steady in a way it hadn't for months. For all the chaos, all the battles fought in boardrooms and neighborhood halls, this moment was about something simple: choosing to stay, and choosing to open the door wider. From the corner of her eye, she caught the boys exchanging a look, a shared grin, quick and conspiratorial. Maybe they already knew what she was only just starting to realize. This wasn't just her decision. It was theirs, together. And it felt a lot like the beginning of something permanent. By the time a week had passed, the winds in Ravenswood Hill had shifted. The same people who once whispered about Samira were now watching Preston Whitmore's reputation unravel. The neighborhood council had opened a formal investigation into his conduct, specifically the deliberate spread of false information for personal gain. His polished image, the one he'd worn like armor for years, began to crack. Business partners pulled out of pending deals. Some sent quiet statements to the press, distancing themselves before his downfall touched them. The local paper ran the headline one Thursday morning: "Whitmore issues public apology amid investigation." It wasn't long, and it wasn't warm. But in bold print, the words "I regret my actions" and "the harm caused" were there for everyone to read. Karim read it at the breakfast table, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. He didn't celebrate, he rarely did, but there was a visible release in his shoulders. "We could sue," his lawyer had reminded him earlier in the week. But Karim had refused. He didn't want courtrooms, didn't want drawn-out battles. He wanted peace. When they finally met face-to-face in a quiet, closed-door room at the council office, Karim's terms were clear. "You'll step down from the council," he told Preston, his voice even. "And you'll keep your distance from my family. No more meddling, no more games." Preston's jaw tightened, but he gave a short nod. "Fine." The word carried the weight of someone who'd run out of cards to play. For Samira, the end of Preston's interference felt like the lifting of a constant, low hum of tension. But her biggest turning point wasn't about him. It was about finally letting herself belong. That Friday afternoon, the black sedan pulled up the gravel drive of Al-Rashid estate. Samira stood at the door as Linda stepped out, guiding a small, wiry girl with cautious eyes. Maya's sneakers scuffed the stone path as she walked. She paused halfway, looking up at the grand front door as if it might swallow her whole. Samira met her halfway, crouching down to be at eye level. Without a word, she held out her hand. Maya hesitated only a moment before slipping her small fingers into Samira's. Inside, Amir and Zayd were waiting, pretending they weren't. When Maya stepped into the foyer, both boys straightened up. Samira looked at the three of them and said, with a steadiness she felt deep in her bones, "From today on, we're here together." It wasn't a grand speech, but it was everything that needed saying. The boys exchanged a glance, and then Zayd took Maya's free hand. Just like that, the space between them was smaller. In the days that followed, something subtle shifted in the way the neighborhood saw her. On Main Street, a woman who'd once crossed the road to avoid her now offered a polite good morning. At the cafe, an older man who had signed Preston's petition against her gave a small nod when their eyes met. No one was rushing to invite her over for Sunday brunch, but the air between them was no longer icy. It was simply neutral. And neutral was a start. That evening, the estate's dining room was warmer than it had been in weeks. The long oak table, usually neat and quiet, buzzed with chatter. Amir and Zayd were leaning across their plates, talking over each other as they tried to tell Maya about the backyard. "There's a tree you can climb all the way to the top," Amir said. "And we have a swing," Zayd started, only for Amir to cut in. "No, the swing's mine on Saturdays." Maya giggled, the sound light and quick, as if she was surprised by her own laughter. At the far end of the table, Karim watched them, his fork idle on his plate. His expression was softer than Samira had ever seen, the kind of smile that came when a person let go of a breath they'd been holding too long. She caught his eye, and he gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything it had taken to get here. It wasn't perfect. There would be arguments over swings and muddy shoes, paperwork to sign, and more nights when the past felt closer than it should. But as Samira listened to the children's voices tumble over one another, she realized that perfection was never the point. The first warm morning of spring brought a softness to the estate that even Karim noticed. Through the open windows, the scent of cherry blossoms drifted in, subtle but persistent. In the living room, above the fireplace, a new photograph hung. Samira, Karim, Amir, Zayd, and Maya standing shoulder to shoulder under the pink canopy of the garden trees. The wind had caught the children's hair, and in the picture, they were all laughing at something just out of frame. Samira lingered in front of it, coffee in hand. To anyone else, it was just a picture, but to her it was proof of battles fought, bridges rebuilt, and the quiet decision each person in that frame had made to stay. Later that week, the five of them were sprawled out on a picnic blanket in the city park. The air was filled with the sound of dogs barking in the distance, the clink of ice cream spoons against paper cups, and the lazy hum of bees drifting from one patch of flowers to another. Maya was on her stomach, drawing in a small sketch pad, when she suddenly looked up at Samira. "Do you have to give birth to someone to be their mom?" Samira paused, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It wasn't the first time a child had asked her this. She set her cup down and smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep recognition. "No," she said softly. "You just have to stay." The words landed like they always did, quiet, but steady enough to sink in. Maya didn't say anything back, but she nodded and went back to her drawing, as if something had been confirmed inside her. As the afternoon stretched on, Karim settled beside Samira, handing her a bottle of water. "I've been thinking," he began, watching the kids chase each other a few yards away. "We could start something bigger. A center. In Boston, maybe. For kids like Amir, Zayd, and Maya. Somewhere they could get help, but also find a home if they needed one." Samira turned to look at him. It wasn't the first time she'd heard Karim talk about helping others, but this was different. His voice wasn't distant or theoretical. He'd already made the decision in his mind. "You're talking about running a place like that?" she asked. "Running it together," he said simply. "If we've learned anything, it's that family doesn't have to be small." She thought about it for a long moment. About the long drives, the paperwork, the late nights. About the faces of the children she'd met over the years, some she'd been able to help, others who'd slipped through the cracks. And then she thought about the photograph in the living room, and how a year ago she couldn't have imagined being in it. By the time they packed up the picnic, the decision was already sitting quietly in her chest. That evening, the estate was alive with the sound of the children's voices drifting through the open back doors. Somewhere inside, the old piano played Layla's lullaby, the notes gentle and familiar, wrapping around the laughter outside. In the fading light, Samira stood just inside the music room doorway, watching Amir and Zayd teach Maya a clumsy version of tag in the garden. Karim walked past her, glancing toward the photograph on the wall. The sunlight hit it at just the right angle, making the image glow. For a moment, Samira let herself breathe it in. The warmth, the noise, the knowledge that they had all chosen this. Chosen each other. No one said the word forever, but in that moment, it didn't need to be spoken. It was already there, in the way they stayed. In the end, this wasn't just a story about winning against lies or silencing the rumors. It was about the quiet, stubborn power of staying when it's easier to walk away. Sometimes, family is the people who choose to hold your hand in the storm, not because they have to, but because they can't imagine letting go. And maybe that's the question we all carry. When the moment comes, will we stay? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Your next favorite story might be just around the corner.